You probably think of canned food as a cheap, convenient pantry staple that lasts forever. But what you take out of those cans is often very different from what went in. Vitamins degrade, minerals shift, and toxic chemicals can leach into the food. By the time you open the can, it may not be something you want to eat. Hello, health champions. Today we're going to talk about 10 canned foods that you want to stay away from. And number 10 is canned fruit. And we hear so often that fruit and vegetables are good for you, and people often lump fruit and vegetables together, so they think fruit is great. And fresh fruit isn't the worst thing you can eat in moderation, and especially seasonally. However, canned fruit is very, very different because they basically have no vitamins. Fresh fruit does have some nutrients, but canned fruit is basically devoid of vitamins. Vitamin C, for example, is very near zero regardless of what they put in the can. And fruit also has some minerals when it's fresh, but when you put it in a can, a lot of those minerals are going to shift from the fruit into the liquid, so they're kind of equally dispersed. And therefore, you have to eat the entire contents of the can. You have to drink or eat the liquid in there, the syrup as well. But now you're getting heavy syrup or light syrup or something that's called in its own juice. And either way, it's going to be loaded with sugar. So half a cup serving, which is not very much at all, can have 25 to 30 grams of sugar in the heavy syrup, 15 to 20 grams of sugar in the light syrup. And when they can it in its own juice, it still has 11 to 16 grams of sugar per half a cup. And if you think about it, if they squeezed the juice from the same fruit, then you wouldn't have any fruit to put in a can. So when they say in its own juice, then it could be maybe the same type of fruit that they make juice from, and then they concentrate it to get it sweet, and they put it in the can. But it's not just the fruit because they've added sugar from that juice. And most people are probably not going to eat just half a cup. That's basically nothing. And I would say most people probably eat about half a can, and now you're getting 45 to 50 grams of sugar in the heavy syrup. You're getting 25 to 35 in the light syrup, and in the thing that's supposed to be only fruit, you're still getting 20 to 30 grams of sugar. And I've said this in many videos. Even if you eat the sugar that only came from fruit, it's exactly the same sugar. Biochemically, the molecule is identical, so it's still going to raise your blood sugar, it's still going to spike insulin, and you process it the same exact way. So for comparison, a can of soda would have 35 to 40 grams of sugar, and a healthy comparison would be a cup of fresh raspberries would have 5 grams of sugar, but it would have amazing taste and nutrients. And also with those raspberries, you get so much fiber, you get more fiber even than there is sugar in there. It's like 7 or 8 grams of fiber. And now that fiber is going to slow down the absorption of the sugar. So this is virtually negligible in terms of sugar content. So I would eat the fresh stuff when you can and stay away from canned fruit. Food number 9 to stay away from is tomato sauces, like pasta sauces. And if you check the label, there's going to be a lot of sugar and seed oils and a lot of processed food stuff in there that you don't want. 8 to 12 grams of sugar per half a cup serving. And again, half a cup isn't all that much, and you're getting something loaded with sugar. But another thing with tomato sauces is that tomatoes have a certain acidity in themselves, and then very often in tomato sauces, they will add citric acid and salt as well. And you might think that, well, my pasta sauce, it's kind of sweet. It doesn't have much acid. Well, yes, it does. It's just that they add so much sugar that you can't taste the acidity. But the acid from the tomatoes, and if they added citric acid, it's all still there. And the problem here is that it's going to eat away at the BPA lining of the can. And this has been a recognized problem for many, many years now. So what they do is they label the cans BPA free. And what that means is they just substitute for another very similar molecule called BPS or BPF, but it doesn't do you any good because the properties are exactly the same. And the problem is that they act as endocrine disruptors. They will mimic estrogen, and even in very, very small doses, they can give rise to hormone imbalances and pretty severe diseases. And in Europe, where they've done most of the research, they have a current limit of 50 parts per billion in food, but they are transitioning. So this is kind of a temporary thing. They're all moving away from that limit all the way down to 0.01 parts per billion, which means that they're basically banning it. And by contrast, in the United States, the limit is 3,000 parts per billion, and they still consider that safe. There is no plan to change that. So we're basically talking about a level 300,000 times bigger. And depending on what numbers you find, they can be hard to compare. Some people compare parts per billion, and some people say nanograms per kilogram of body mass and so forth. So some numbers are going to give you like tens of thousands, and others, the ones that I found, were hundreds of thousands. Either way, these differences are astronomical, and they probably know something in Europe that the US FDA or USDA won't listen to if they're going to take it as low as that. But then there are other types of tomato sauces also that aren't like ready to eat. They're made for cooking. So now you have canned tomatoes, like crushed tomatoes, and sometimes they make tomato sauces and they add the citric acid and the salt to those. So now you have the acidity of the tomatoes again, plus citric acid, plus salt. And all these three things will eat away at that lining. So you would do well if you use canned tomatoes once in a while, then pick something that's just plain crushed tomatoes where there's no salt and no citric acid, because now you just have 1 out of 3 factors eat away at that lining. And that way there's going to be a whole lot less leaching of this BPA into the food. So if you use canned tomatoes once in a while, it's like with everything else. Make sure that 90% or 95% of what you eat is fresh food, and then the rest of it isn't going to kill you, but you still want to do the best you can. And what I'd really like to see is that they put this stuff in glass jars. And right now, you can find crushed tomatoes in glass jars, but they're outrageously expensive because there's so few people doing it. So you could pay $5, $6, $7 for a jar. And this is ridiculous because it doesn't have to be any more expensive. Glass is very inexpensive and it's very environmentally friendly if you recycle it. So if you go to Walmart and you look in the spaghetti sauce section, you can find these big jars of spaghetti sauce for $1.50, $1.80. So it's not putting it in a glass jar that's expensive. It's just that they have chosen not to do that, and there's no competition with the glass jars. So be aware of that and start looking for glass jars and start asking for glass jars, and then maybe in 10 years we'll actually have them. And something else you can use, obviously, is fresh tomatoes. And you could boil them, you could blanch them and skin them and do all of that stuff. Or what I do is when I buy too many tomatoes and I don't have time to eat them all, and there's just a few leftovers and they start getting a little bit wrinkly, but they're still sort of okay, then I put them in the freezer. And sometimes I put the whole tomatoes in the freezer. Sometimes I blend them first in a high-speed blender. And then you could keep them in the freezer and just take out as much as you need. And even if you just have a few tomatoes left over here and there, over time, you could get quite a few in the freezer. And then You blend them high speed and then you can cook with them. Food number 8 is canned beans. And things like baked beans you want to stay away from. If you check the labels, there'll be something like 18 grams of sugar per half a cup. Again, half a cup is a tiny little bit. 18 grams of sugar per volume. That's sweeter than Coca-Cola. But not only that, they also contain things like seed oils and chemicals and artificial flavors, etc. Plus, they still have that acid and the salt that can leach out the BPA. Another thing to keep in mind is that anytime we put food in a can with liquid, which is typically the case, now the minerals are going to migrate from the food into the liquid, so they'll be equally dispersed. And that's especially potassium and magnesium. And now, if you drain off the fluid, you're going to drain off a significant portion of the minerals. So even if the food was pretty good to start with, now you're sort of processing it. You're getting rid of a lot of the nutrients. So one type of beans that would be much better would be just plain beans, like black beans in a can or pinto beans or something like that, because they're not very acidic. And if they don't add any salt, if you just get the plain ones, now there's very little leaching of that BPA in the can. And I want to give credit to one company, which is basically the only one. It's called Eden, and they can vegetables. And they did a lot of research, and they fought a lot to figure out what were they using before BPA. And the answer was there's something called ola resin, which is a vegetable extract that you can use to line cans with. So they use actually this ola resin can. They special order them. They're more expensive. But they don't want to put BPA in their cans unless they have to. So if you get plain beans from Eden, you can get something that doesn't have any BPA at all. Now, Eden, they do actually canned tomatoes also, but they don't do it in metal jars, in metal cans. They do it in glass jars because the ola resin does not hold up to the acidity in tomatoes. Food number 7 is canned soup. And here you're getting a chemical concoction. You're getting sugar, seed oils, thickeners, MSG, flavor additives, etc., etc. And some of the things to look for on the can would be hydrolyzed protein or yeast extract. And those are pseudonyms for MSG because people have learned to look out for MSG. They know that's not a good thing. So they disguise it as other fancy words. And there's about 50 different phrases. You could do a Google search and try to figure out what they are. But you don't want to have these things in excess. And pretty much all soup is made with these things. And you're also going to get about 2,500 milligrams of sodium in a regular small can. And that's about the total allowance for a day that is recommended. Now, I don't agree with that low a limit. I think salt is fine. The problem is that here you're getting the sodium totally unbalanced. And in the body, it's super important that we get sodium balanced with the other electrolytes because that's how the kidney can shuttle things in and out of cells and keep the good stuff and keep the appropriate amounts. But if we have all sodium, if we have super high levels of sodium and no potassium and magnesium and calcium to balance it, that becomes very, very hard work for the kidneys, and we're going to end up depleting these other minerals even further. So if you were to eat a canned soup, which I don't recommend on a regular basis, then you would want to serve it with some mineral-rich food, something that has a lot of potassium and magnesium. And you pretty much have to go to fresh food, to fresh plants and nuts and seeds. So something like avocado or cauliflower or pumpkin seed would be really good sources. Food number 6 is tuna in vegetable oil. And the vegetable oil is soybean oil or canola every time. And what happens now, the fish is also high in mercury unless it's been tested. So I'm not saying that you should never eat tuna in a can. I'm just telling you which kinds to stay away from. And there are some types that have much less mercury, and there are some that are certified mercury-free or extremely low levels, and those would be the ones to go for. Another thing to keep in mind is that if they can it in these vegetable oils like soybean oil or canola, you definitely want to drain off the oil so you don't consume that. But now, some of the omega-3s that you do want, they will have mixed in with the oil that you're discarding. So you're getting rid of something that you really wanted, something that's kind of the best thing in tuna. And a lot of these are also going to be very high in salt, like we talked about, with no potassium and magnesium to balance. So I think tuna in a can is fine, but you want to pick a safe type, a safe brand, and you want to get it in water or in olive oil, and then you make sure you consume all the oil so you don't waste those omega-3s. Other good alternatives would be sardines or mackerel, but the same thing holds true, then they should be in water or in olive oil. Number 5 is canned pasta meals like spaghetti or ravioli. And with this, you're getting a bunch of stuff you don't want. You're getting white flour, you're getting sugar, sugary sauces, you're getting seed oils. And if they have meat in the sauce or in the ravioli, they're probably going to be some of the lowest grade meat you can find. Other things they will probably use are things like modified food starch and artificial flavorings and stabilizers and chemicals. And again, there's going to be very high in sodium without any potassium and magnesium. So sodium is not terrible. We've been scared too much about sodium, but we need to keep it in balance with the other minerals. Number 4 is canned meat dishes. And some of the worst would be Vienna sausages. Now, it's been decades since I had those, but it's just the texture. It's like, what is that stuff? And also meat stews or chili. What are you getting? You're getting meat, maybe, or probably pink slime and ground up leftovers. They're not going to use the best stuff in there. And if they're saying specially selected ingredients, they're probably being truthful. And they specifically selected the cheapest stuff they could find. Furthermore, you're going to get things like sugar, seed oils, MSG, etc. And they're going to try to fill this out with the cheapest stuff they can find, like I said. And things to look for would be textured vegetable protein or soy protein concentrate. And it's going to hold true for all these canned foods. Pretty much, they're high in sodium and no other minerals to balance. So when it comes to things like chili, I eat a lot of chili, but I make it from scratch. I use grass-fed organic ground beef. I either cook the black beans from scratch in a pressure cooker, or I use the best cans I can find. And also, I don't do this all the time. I do use some canned foods, but it's pretty much only plain canned tomatoes and plain canned beans. And like I said, more than 90% of the food would still be fresh food cooked from scratch. Food number 3 is canned vegetables, and they have a lot of additives, probably more than a lot of other canned food, because they're trying to preserve the texture, and that doesn't work so well with vegetables. So they have firming agents and color fixers, and some examples would be calcium disodium EDTA, which is for stability. Another one would be calcium chloride for texture. And of course, this is purely a texture chemical, but now they can also add calcium on the label and make it look good as if it had a nutrient in it. And vegetables do have a good amount of minerals to start with, but first they cook them and they get rid of a lot of minerals there, and then a lot of minerals again will leach into the liquid in the can, and you're pretty much always going to drain the liquid from a canned vegetable, so you're losing minerals that way. And I think just how limp and lifeless those vegetables are is plenty of reason to stay away from canned vegetables. And just like with everything else, we still have the BPA issue. Food number 2 is canned fish when they make some sort of sauce, because these sauces are not the best. You're going to see on the ingredient list things like sugar, seed oil, and MSG. Again, they'll be high in sodium without minerals to balance. So they start out with a great thing, which is usually something like sardines or mackerel, but then they ruin it with all these chemicals and the sugar. So make sure that you get yours in water or in olive oil. And number 1 is condensed milk, especially sweetened. So what you're really getting here is you're getting a sugar, dairy, and chemical concoction, a concentrate. And you're going to find as much as 20 grams of sugar in a 2 tablespoon serving. So basically nothing. It's like 2/3 of that thing is sugar. So if a recipe or a dessert or something calls for it, then I suggest you use regular heavy whipping cream or coconut cream, and then you sweeten that with stevia. So when it comes to these foods that I've talked about, it's sort of like with processed foods overall, that make sure that 90% of what you eat is fresh, whole food, and use these products in moderation. One way that they can come in handy is as a backup. If you are snowed in, if the power is out, if it's long enough that your freezer melts and you can't use it, then it could be handy to have a can of something. And if you use it very rarely, it's not going to kill you. But just like processed foods, just like pollution, just like chemical toxicity burden, the more you use it, the more those little things just tend to add up, and it makes a big difference. And don't fall into the trap of eating a lot of your meals out of a can, like ravioli or spaghetti or soup. Just because they tell you that it's a good meal, it's not. It's very cheap, it's very convenient, but it's not going to do you any favors in the long run. So like I said, what I do is I use them occasionally. I use like crushed tomatoes, I use black beans in a can, and I get them plain without salt or acid. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.